All right, as I said, political geography is our topic this week. I forgot to fill up my water. Uh, so, political geography, well, as you can see here in this, what this slide says, it's all about power. And people often will think of borders as these eternal things, or they'll think of nation borders as things that kind of make some sort of sense, and they often just don't. It's just kind of the political will of different people in different points in time. So let's talk about some definitions of things. States, right? It's a recent phenomena, right? What does that mean that it's a recent phenomena? Even thinking of a nation used to be, and when we hear about nationalism, right? Usually nationalism is put in a bad context, right? It's like the Nazis were nationalists. When nationalism first kind of became a thing, it was when there were monarchies. And so there was a new way of thinking about things of a nation. And so, for example, let's say you're French and you live in France. If it was during the monarchy, well, if you're fighting in a war, you're fighting for the monarchy. You're doing things to bring wealth to the monarchy. Everything is about the monarchy. Individual people didn't have, like, even the concept of individual human rights were not really a thing. It was through time, actually, that people kind of started thinking about, well, what if we did things for, like, the national good, for all of our good, and not just the super wealthy people who already have everything, who are the monarchy, right? And so we had big revolutions, obviously the French Revolution, overthrew the monarchy, and this is when a lot of nations started switching over to, again, thinking of a population and a nation as a nation is for its population and for everyone's kind of betterment, right? And obviously that has not happened perfectly throughout space and time, and it wasn't until later that nationalism started kind of going an extra amount of suggesting that if you weren't from the dominant ethnicity of that nation, then you weren't considered a person anymore, right? That is the Nazism and fascism and things like that. That's the kind of main difference through time, and why these things are still kind of new concepts. Just some maps from the book of countries of the world. A lot of these things are coming up actually when we're kind of watching Ukraine in the news. I'm sure a lot of you are still kind of watching that day by day. Well, you know, internationally, the U.S. tends to believe that nations have their own self-determination, right? If you're a nation state, you have your own identity, you have your own politics, and you should have control over your own borders. That is not the belief of all countries in the world. A lot of countries throughout the world think that they have certain rights to other territories and other boundaries, kind of depending on history or whim. Many of the nation states today, one of the reasons they don't make sense is because they are put in place to not make sense, especially during colonialism when European powers made boundaries of countries. Very often they would want to split up different ethnicities in countries that they had colonized, and divide them between different countries because they didn't want a large group of people to kind of come together to fight off their colonial powers that had taken place there, right? So a lot of these countries, a lot of wars that have happened through time, well, those wars often happen because, as I said, the country's borders split up people. And so you have a lot of different fights for places to kind of create their new identities, create their own identities, create their own actual territorial spaces. So an example, looking at South Africa, of a couple different terms we'll be using. An enclave, a piece of territory separated from the main country. Example in Russia, in Russia, the example is because, well, Russia doesn't have a lot of good ports. Well, they didn't until they invaded Crimea and took it over, and then they had a really great port. But they had a little bit of land way over on another side of Europe that is not connected to the rest of Russia at all. But they won it in a war a long time ago, and so they feel like they still have sovereignty of that. And actually, no one has ever said that they don't have sovereignty over that area. Exclave, a country completely surrounded by another country. You could see some kind of examples. Well, this here is a different country, this is a different country, right? And these are within South Africa. And these are basically territories that were kind of the center of some of the older civilizations that were there before colonialism, although people have been moved around all over the place. When we're looking at the shapes of countries, I think I got a map showing shapes of countries. Very often, their shapes kind of, well, you use the example of France, right? France, the borders have natural borders. You have mountains, you have the ocean, and France, when it comes to ethnicity, is a bit more of a kind of unitarian type of a place. Now you have some places like Chile, which is one country, but it's a really, really long border, right? Almost along all of South America. Although it's a very long country, well, it has something right along here that makes a real nice border, which is a great big mountain range that goes the whole length of the country. So that is a bit of a unifying factor. I was mentioning the little area that Russia has that is not connected to Russia. It's just over here, over kind of by Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, in that area. Indonesia, similar to a place like the Philippines, very, very dispersed populations and dispersed land masses. They've had to have some different specific policies to try to actually unify their population. One of those policies was, well, to be sticking with Indonesia specifically, it was actually a lot of different languages and a lot of different ethnicities. If you have places that are a lot of islands, well, people have been separated out for long periods of time, and so languages and things just kind of evolve. But they created a unified language, and even that was tricky when they were picking what language that they would use as their national language, because they didn't want to use a language of, they wanted one language, right? But they didn't want to use a language of a colonizer, because the colonizer was like, try to force that on the population. They didn't want to use a language that was spoken by one of the very powerful ethnicities in the area, because that would just be giving them more power, right? If all of a sudden all books and signs and everything has to be in that language, well, that gives people who are, that's their first language, a leg up. So they picked a language, I believe it's just called Indonesian, but it's a language that many, many people knew, even though it wasn't their first language. Most people knew the language, and so it was felt that could pick that, it could be a unifying thing. Indonesia also trying to unify a diffused place like this. They have taken on as part of their national identity diversity. Diversity is just part of their national identity, and they say, you know what makes us us is how different we are, right? Something that a lot of countries don't do. I think the U.S. does that a bit. Depends on who you talk to, I guess. Cultural signifiers. You know, the book, this chapter talks a lot about borders and has lots of examples of things from different borders, but also things that are kind of a unifying national monuments in different ways. I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Berlin Wall. Well, this is when we had the Berlin Wall there. This was the place where kind of like there was the big speech by Reagan saying to tear down the wall. This is kind of where a lot of the big pressures of reunifying Europe were. So there's lots of things that kind of go to split apart countries. There are a lot of things that come to bring countries together, right? I mentioned language in that one example. National museums, you might not even think of it, but you go to a national museum or a national park, you're partaking in a specific story of a specific place, right? And although these things do change, like if you go to a national museum, the books and the stuff change through times and the stories change, but they're still usually a uniting thing, right? National symbols. And there's, of course, things that are splitting up countries, splitting up places. I got a map here of what's called Kurdistan, but it's not a country, right? This is a ethnicity. This is a wants to be a country. But as you can see, even if you could snap your fingers and decide, okay, the Kurds get their own country, well, it'd be taking out parts of all kinds of different countries, right? Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, some of Iran, right? None of these countries want to give up power or control. In fact, there's large military skirmishes usually because these populations do want to have their own control over their own nation and their own culture and their own identity. But none of these countries want to give up any. All right. Let's see. Another example in the book is looking at Myanmar. Used to be called Burma back in colonial times. A lot of countries, when colonial times ended, they made an effort to start bringing names back to what they had been originally before colonialism. Well, as you can see, there's a lot of different ethnicities and national groups. And I was mentioning before about how there are populations that are along the borders, that are along coasts, that are similarly being displaced due to sea rise and things like that. So you have populations that are, you could see you'll just have one ethnicity there in that little area. If they're displaced, other places will see their populations coming in as a sort of invasion, right? Armed conflicts can happen from even less. I would say we don't see a lot of countries kind of becoming larger these days. If anything, we see countries fragment. Sometimes it's called balkanization because the Balkans in Europe used to have through different points in time been larger countries, but because they have very distinct different ethnicities, they often will have wanted to kind of go their own routes. Let's see, Indonesia, East Timor, well, they split off from Indonesia, even though I was talking about how Indonesia attempts to kind of unify. This is one place that really just didn't want to have anything to do with the rest of the islands. South Sudan split off from North Sudan. This is a very large and long-armed conflict. Sudan itself, as you can see right here, it's a huge country. It is just huge. And the northern area, you have Arabian populations throughout North Africa, and a really good percentage of Sudan. Now, you have in the south of Sudan populations that are more related to sub-Saharan African populations, different languages, different customs, different religions. But you have a lot of oil wealth throughout the country, and the northern area that has the Arab populations did not want to give up access to those other areas. As it says here, it took a long civil war. Talked about the Kurds a little bit. Catalonians also in Spain. They've been going back and forth about splitting off from Spain. Catalonia has its own language, own ethnic identity. Very similar to the rest of Spain, but enough different that its population often kind of feels like it wants to break ties. It's in no small part because the area of Catalonia is actually quite wealthy, and a lot of wealthy areas of the world feel like that they are unduly burdened by the poor parts of their countries, and so they'll often want to split off, and often they'll have the resources to do it because they're wealthier area. let's see. Complex map, a lot going on here. I'm not going to read every detail. I'm just looking to see if there's anything specific I can kind of point out of interest. Well, I will just say you could see the orange nation states with sizable ethnic minorities that are excluded from power structures, right? You have not just Russia, but the places that used to be in the former Soviet Union. Actually, this is Turkey and Iran. So the former Soviet Union is kind of like here. China, a couple different areas. Let's see, I mentioned Catalonia. Like I said, there's a big movement to separate. So let's see. This map here, I'm sure you could tell, is Russia. Russia, you know, it's in the news a lot, so it's also in this chapter a lot, which is kind of handy. Russia is a place that, although the core region that it kind of started from is about the same size as like other European countries. So in a lot of ways, the logic of Russia being such a gigantic place still into our modern day, well after kind of colonialism has mostly subsided, because that's what an empire is. They grew through time, they took over new areas, and as they did, they had a policy of Russification. Take over an area, you mandate your language, your culture, outlaw things that are of the local cultures, whether it's their religion or, as I said, language or whatever else. Even sometimes you'd have laws against cultural practices like what the clothing our people wear, right? Russia has been through this process, as you can see, for hundreds of years. And that is why, if you see on the news, Putin in Russia will talk about Ukraine as if it's really just part of Russia. And there's a mindset among certain people in Russia who feel that areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union should still be under their control and domain. And this is in no small part because empires, well, you have a core region and you have a peripheral region. And in general, the goal is to take resources from your peripheral regions, often leaving these areas in poverty, and you bring these resources to the central region where people will tend to be very wealthy because they're taking all these resources from their surrounding regions, right? Crimea, which is the area that Russia took over in 2014, I think it was. That's where that is. I already talked about Kurdistan quite a bit. A stateless nation, right? It's still a nation as far as having people who share that identity. They share a distinctive culture. They would like to have a state, just probably not too possible. So different types of states. You know, we're probably most familiar with federal state, right? I'll just read it. A government that disperses power to subnational units, which helps reduce centrifugal forces, is called a federal state, right? So what that means is the United States is organized in a way that gives individual states some amount of say in their own policies in the hopes that that amount of freedom of those states would make it so they're less likely to break away from the United States, right? Not that it ever happens. Obviously, there was a civil war, right? States decided that they didn't like the national states' policies and wanted to break away. That kind of thing happens in lots of places. Government with strong central authority where policies are applied uniformly throughout the territory, called a unitary state. China is a big example of that because it has the country of China still has large amounts of territory that are of different ethnicities and different cultural groups that it still has complete control over. Let's get out of order. Let me check my PowerPoints real quick. I was sure that I was going to cover more of... Oh, I come come back to it. All right. Sorry about that. So since this is political geography, I'm going to talk about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, well, as you know, we have congressional districts and people who are elected as congressional representatives. Gerrymandering is, each time we do a census and we see kind of where people are, that is the time that you can change your census districts and your voting districts. And if, for example, perhaps you have one political party that if you had voting districts that were just kind of evenly divided, actually I got one on another slide here. Right, if you had people, let's say votes were split up into oranges and purples, right? If you had districts that were like this, well, the oranges would be perfectly represented by their representative, right? Purples would be perfectly represented by whoever they vote for. Realistically, that's not how districts go. They go a bit like this. Now, at first sight, this seems like relatively fair way to split up voting areas, but as you can see, each district, whoever the purple candidate was, is going to win, right? It's like, really no matter what. They could be pretty terrible. Maybe they lose one of their dots, but they'd probably still get in. Gerrymandering is a bit more like this. Is a bit more, well, let's make a district so that an orange representative can be elected here, and then, a purple representative here, that's fine. Another orange representative. And so that's why these congressional districts can get so weird. It's because it's within the states that they decide these things. And you have politicians who are making the decisions. So they may be a politician who, they'll well, look at this. This even goes across this area here. But they could say, well, these are my voters, so I really want to just kind of get them together somehow. That's gerrymandering. Another congressional district over in Illinois. The same type of stuff. Red states versus blue states. That's another little area in this chapter. People know why we call them red states and blue states? But why? Why? Who got red and who got blue? But why? It's kind of funny. So this really came about in the 2000 election. Colors of our flag are red, white, and blue, right? Well, the TV stations, when they're putting together the colors for different parties, they didn't coordinate this, but they all just kind of said to themselves, well, red, white, and blue. We're not going to have a party be the white party. That's pretty weird, right? It's like, well, we got blue and red then. Well, we can't call the Democrats the red party because they've been painted as red communists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So let's just have the Republicans be the red. They can't complain about it because it's color of our flag, and the Democrats will be the blue. There was one channel, one network that didn't do that. They flipped the colors for whatever conversation they had. But then once they saw the other networks were all choosing to have blues be Democrats and the reds be Republicans, they then switched as well. So that is how we get these color mixtures today that really don't make a lot of sense. But so a lot of maps came out after that election, trying to kind of make sense of where we were going as a country. This was one of the more kind of interesting maps. Let's start off simple. Right, so red and blue, right? Because we have an electoral college system and we kind of have a state-by-state winner-takes-all system, well, that is why you can have a vote where someone doesn't get the most votes, but they still lose, right? George Bush II, right? He did not get a majority of votes, but he still won, right? Donald Trump as well, right? Similar scenario, 2016. And this map, a lot of people felt didn't accurately kind of show how divided the country was, because obviously, I'm sure as many of you can see, a lot of these states have a much higher population, a lot of them have much lower population. So showing just a flat map like this, maps that adjusted for population became much more popular. So you started seeing lots of skewed and twisted up maps. They also started doing ones where population, well, you could see big cities go blue, right? Also, people started becoming more nuanced in their maps, and maps would become a lot more purple to them, because that is how it is, right? It's like, well, Minnesota, right? Blue state. Minnesota's been a pretty thoroughly Democratic state for a long time. We're the only state that voted for the Democrat Mondale for president against Ronald Reagan. It was just us. But in reality, I'm sure many of you, if you're in the city, you'll see lots of things that are pretty liberal. But if you kind of drive out further, you'll see lots of political signs that are very different, right? And so the political reality is our country is a lot more kind of mixed than these types of maps would make them seem, right? If you had a more nuanced maps. You know, other